This episode is brought to you by Mountain View Seeds. Mountain View Seeds partners with breeders and growers across the country to develop and supply high-performing forage genetics. Our alfalfa program focuses on strong yield potential, forage quality, disease resistance, and stand persistence. Varieties like MVS 4220Q, Majestic 425, and the New Mix alfalfa line are built to perform in real-world conditions and help producers get more from every acre. Learn more about the Mountain View Seeds alfalfa program at mountainviewseeds.com. That's mtviewseeds.com.
Welcome back to the HPJ Talk podcast. I'm Kylie Reiss, and today I have with me co-host Kylene Scott and our special guest, Don Miller with Mountain View Seeds. Don, you have 50 years of experience in the alfalfa industry. To start off, could you share a little bit about your background as a plant breeder and how you got involved in the industry?
Sure, yeah. I'm originally from New Mexico and Texas, and then my family had a small ranch in central Texas, and I'd spend my summers down there. But eventually I decided to go to college and went to New Mexico State University, and originally had no idea that I was actually going to have a career in plant breeding and developing alfalfa varieties. I started college as a biology major and eventually got my bachelor's degree in biology. And by that time, I'd already started a family and was looking for a job. And just by luck, the alfalfa breeder at New Mexico State University was looking for a technician for his breeding project. And so I applied for that job, and I had a little bit of experience in some of the things that were important to that job. I'd worked as a field scout for an entomology service during the summer months when I was going to college. And so I checked alfalfa fields and corn and cotton fields for harmful insects. And so Dr. Melton was doing a project and trying to screen for resistance to a certain insect in alfalfa. And so I knew what those insects were. And with my biology background, that also gave me some experience in when they were doing some disease work on the alfalfa project. So Dr. Melton hired me, and from then on, I was on a path to become an alfalfa breeder, I think. So
you continue it on that path. What led you to your role at Mountain View Seeds, and what does your day-to-day work look like there at Mountain View?
I started on that alfalfa project with Dr. Melton, and he was a technician. And the university had a program where if you worked full-time for the university, you could take classes, 1 to 2 classes every semester, free of charge. You had to make up the time. You still had to work 40 hours a week, but you could take those classes. And so I was enjoying what I was doing with Dr. Melton and his project. And so I started taking agronomy classes, and eventually got all the agronomy classes taken. And then Dr. Melton allowed me to continue on as a graduate student, and I started the project on the master's in agronomy and completed all that, and then eventually moved on to get a PhD in agronomy, still working full-time for the university, but that meant that I was there at New Mexico State for 10 years. But during that time period, I was able to learn quite a bit about alfalfa, good experience. Dr. Melton always had a lot of graduate students, and so in the program as a technician, I got to work on all those different projects and learned all different aspects of breeding alfalfa, insect work, disease work, and also we got involved in the drought tolerance. And so that really gave me a wide range of experience in alfalfa. And after I completed my PhD, then a seed company, a national seed company, came and hired me to run their alfalfa breeding program for the Western United States. And so they sent me to Idaho, and my job was to develop alfalfa varieties for the Western United States. And I ran that station in Idaho, and then eventually we added another station in California. And so I was managing 2 alfalfa locations for the Western United States. And over the years, a lot of company mergers and everything, but again, I was breeding alfalfa varieties for the Western United States, and then that also expanded into breeding alfalfa varieties for South America, Argentina. I used to have research locations evaluating material in Argentina, and then eventually we were marketing varieties in Europe and then in the Middle East and different parts of the world. And it gave me a lot of experience over the years. And then eventually I did the plant breeding for about 25 years or so, and then moved into another role. I became the director of product development for one of those major companies. And essentially what my job was to travel around the country, be with the salesmen in different parts of the country and meet with farmers, do grower meetings, and obtain feedback from all the farmers, whether our varieties were working or did they still lack some improvement that would be crucial for their productivity on their farm. And so eventually I did that for another 10, 15 years. And then eventually, at the end of my career there, Alpharex was a division, the alfalfa division of Corteva, decided to sell the company, and they let everybody go and in that process of trying to sell the company. And so I was available and to do something new, and Mountain View Seeds approached me and said, there's been a lot of consolidation in the alfalfa industry, and we think this would be a time to add alfalfa into our forage portfolio. Mountain View is a major player in forage grasses, also turf grasses, and then also cover crops, but they didn't have alfalfa in their portfolio. And Mark Thomas, who worked for Mountain View Seeds, approached me and said, you help us acquire some genetics and bring alfalfa into our forage portfolio. And so that's how I ended up at Mountain View.
Looking back at your career, what developments in alfalfa breeding have been the most significant?
I think early on in my career, we were alfalfa breeders at the universities and also in private industry. We're trying to improve alfalfa and its persistence out in the field. And at that time, we didn't have much disease resistance in the varieties that we were marketing. And so all that early work was trying to incorporate better disease resistance, insect resistance. We were getting some new aphids. Spotted aphid became an issue in the 50s, and then the 70s, the blue aphid became an issue. And so again, we were trying to improve alfalfa varieties for whatever traits were needed to maintain the stand life and longevity and also production. Early on, I think the efforts were in those areas of improving resistance. Later on, we started looking at other factors that might be important in alfalfa production. Salinity tolerance. A lot of the western United States has a saline problem in the soils, and it can be an issue of getting alfalfa established. And then eventually, we also looked at drought tolerance. And while I was at New Mexico State, at the Southwest, water's always an issue, and I was involved in some of the early work that was being done on developing drought tolerance in alfalfa. And so I think over time, the priorities changed, but I think early on, the disease resistance was important. Later on, having resistance or tolerance to some of these other things. And yield was always important. We're always trying to improve yield. But again, anything that might limit production or give an added quality or benefit to the farmer in raising alfalfa, we were looking at.
You touched on those things already, but when you talk with growers, what kind of variety traits are they prioritizing? Do they really want the drought resistance? Are they talking about insects? What kind of things come to the top of the list with the producers?
When you talk to a grower, depending on where he is in the United States, if they've had a problem with a certain insect in the past, that they sure enough want to, when they plant a new alfalfa field, they want to have one that has resistance to that insect or disease. And so different parts of the country, the upper Midwest, Aphanomyces root rot is an important trait to have in a variety that you select. Out west, maybe stem nematode is important, or salinity, or anywhere in the western United States, drought, having available water for alfalfa production is important. I just looked at a USDA report that came out in January, and it said that 27% of the alfalfa acres in the United States or under some level of drought stress. And drought is becoming a more and more important issue going forward. And some farmers they have adequate water, other farmers don't have adequate water throughout the season. So maybe drought tolerance is something that they would look at. And so it varies between regions of what's most important for that farmer.
Is Mountain View Seeds currently working on any new varieties that you could share about, maybe particularly for the Plains region?
Yeah, I think for the Plains region, Mountain View, when we started looking at getting alfalfa varieties for our forage portfolio, we wanted to see if there were certain niches that we could fit. I think salinity was important out west, the drought was important out west. And so those are the type of genetics we started looking for. Anything where stress is involved, climate change is upon us. And I think I always quote climate change genetics is what we're looking for going into the future. Can we have alfalfa varieties that can withstand some of the stress that is coming about due to climate change? And so salinity is an issue. As we have temperatures rise in the west, rainfall patterns change. If we don't have enough water, salinity starts building up in the soils, and we can't leach the salts out because we don't have adequate water supplies. And also, if we don't have enough water for the whole season, the drought tolerance is an important thing. And so I think in our product lineup, we've added, 4 to 5 varieties that have salinity tolerance. We also approached New Mexico State University. I've always been involved in following their breeding program because I was there for so many years. And even some of the companies I worked for over the years funded some of the research at New Mexico State University on drought tolerance. And so eventually, a year and a half ago, New Mexico State University, the alfalfa breeder, Dr. Ian Ray, came to a point where he could release 3 alfalfa varieties for drought tolerance and what we call drought resilience, the ability to recover if that field is put under drought stress for a period of time. And so I told Mark Thomas that at Mountain View, I thought that was something that we ought to pursue and adding to our lineup. And so we approached New Mexico State University, and they put out for bid 3 alfalfa varieties, a Fulton C5 and 2/8, and we acquired all 3 of them. And so we have that in our breeding lineup, and I think that's going to really do well out west and also in the plains. So we've actually had a lot of interest from the growers in the plains in the drought tolerance, and so we're actually getting some of that out this coming year in the plains. And also those varieties are doing well in California, even under normal irrigation. So they're top-of-the-line genetics. You just have that added insurance package that if you are limited in water, these varieties will perform and recover from periods of drought stress and come back to normal production. Or if you have adequate water, they're still top-of-the-line varieties. And so good genetics, and that's part of what we're looking at. In addition to the drought and salinity, we're also looking at alfalfa varieties that have different type of root structure. Branch-rooted alfalfa, we've added that into our lineup. Branch roots gives you an advantage in high water tables where the roots can't penetrate into that soggy soils. Or if you have a hard pan, the alfalfa, that branch root is really an advantage. And so we see that as an advantage in some parts of the United States. And then also we're looking at 2 varieties with grazing tolerance, parts of the U.S. where grazing might be an issue. And also, since we have such a strong lineup in forage grasses, we're seeing an increase in alfalfa grass mixes, and we're seeing that our alfalfa varieties could be very valuable to farmers that are looking at raising alfalfa and grass in a mix. And so those are the type of things, different types of genetics. Yield's always important, but if we can hit certain niches that climate change might be important to these type of genetics, we see that as a means of marketing those varieties.
Speaking of the varieties, about how long does it take to get a new one from breeding all the way to the market?
Our standard number is 10 years. And the reason it's so long is that, say if you get a new insect in an area and you try to breed for resistance to it, it may take 2 or 3 generations of selection to get the genetic resistance up high enough to be economic advantage. And so 2 to 3 years, maybe up to 4, just in developing that line. And then once you have a line, then you have to test it for several years. Alfalfa's, and so you can't just rely on 1 year's of yield data. You have to have it out in the field for at least 3 years and maybe 4 years to evaluate it over time. Is it going to persist past that first year and still perform in that 3rd and 4th year that the farmers might want? And so you've got 3 or 4 years for development, and then maybe another 3 or 4 years for testing. And then after that, once you've determined which lines are worth going forward, then it's going to take about 2 years to get the seed increased to the levels that you can market it.
Throughout your career working with several producers, what management decisions have you seen separate the successful forage operations from the rest?
I think what makes a successful alfalfa grower is one that really pays attention to the details. If you've got a weed problem, you need to spray it on time. If you've got an insect problem, you don't need to wait until it's really showing a lot of damage out there. Monitoring your fields, I think, is important. Some of the better producers keep close tabs on their production. But I think the very first thing is selecting a good variety. And there's always that temptation to go out there and buy the cheapest alfalfa seed out there because it's going to take 20, 25 pounds per acre. And if you reduce your cost right there at the front, your thinking is maybe I've got to stand and I've saved some money. But at the end, really, it pays to get a decent alfalfa variety, one that's adapted to your area, one that will persist in your location, has a winter survival. If you're in an area where it has cold winters and there might be some winter kill, you want to get a variety that's going to persist under those type of conditions. And then, just a variety that has the yield potential. And also, if you've had problems with certain insects or diseases, you sure enough need to buy a variety that has that genetic resistance to those pests. So I think the good producers are not just cheap on the seed that they're buying. They can see the value in the better genetics. Then if you have a variety that you didn't pay much for, and maybe it only lasts 2 years and you want it to last 3 or 4 years, and you're going to lose money because you're going to have to replace that field sooner than expected. Or if it has insects, you don't have genetic resistance to that insect, you're going to have to spray, and so you have added costs. So it really, at the end of the day, a good variety pays for its cost, and it only takes about a half a ton of improved yields over 3 or 4 years that pay for the additional cost of a good variety. And so I think good producers realize the advantage of having a good variety to start with, and it creates a lot less problems over the time of that stand, and it's more productive.
I touched on a couple of things. What are some common mistakes that growers tend to make when they establish or they're managing an alfalfa stand?
We have farmers that sometimes be trying to establish a new alfalfa field, and they'll call up and say, didn't get a good stand, it must be something wrong with the seed. And so we go out and look at those fields and try to diagnose what the issues are. And for the most part, a poor stand, very seldom is it the actual seed that is an issue. Is did they have a good seed bed? Did they prepare that field, firm seed bed, where you plant that seed and you can determine the correct seeding depth of that seed that you're placing out in the field? Sometimes they just don't have a firm seed bed and they go out there and plant their alfalfa and they get it too deep. If you get over an inch deep, normally the alfalfa won't come up. And so soft soils just don't place that seed at the right depth. And so a lot of initial stands are failures due to that. And very seldom is it the actual seed that is the issue. And I think that is one of the most common issues of getting a poor stand to begin with. And then also maybe skimping on the quality of the variety that you try to plant. Maybe there are some fungal diseases that, like a phantom, that's a root rot that can also be a damping off disease. And so if you've got a variety that doesn't have genetic resistance to that pathogen, maybe you don't get a good stand. And again, there are certain things that you need to do to get a good stand. And then once you've got a good stand, you need to reduce whatever stress that the field is exposed to over the life of the stand. You plant it at the right time. You can cut it a little bit early. It usually takes about a month, 28 days, depending on the time of the year between cuts. But sometimes growers will want to push the envelope a little bit and get better quality, dairy quality hay, and they'll cut maybe at 20 days. And you can do that once or twice during the season, but if you do it too much, then that stand will start to suffer. You don't have the root reserves to maintain that stand over time. And so you need to be aware that if you are cutting a little bit early, 1 or 2 cuts in the season, you need to extend that final cut before you go into the winter and make sure that the root reserves are replenished going into the winter. Just to make sure you have good fertility out there. You're trying to maximize yield, but if you don't have the adequate fertility for the type of tonnage that you're going to produce or expect, you won't reach your production goals. And so those are the type of things that don't be afraid to put a little bit of money into that alfalfa. As long as your return on investment is there, I think your production will be good.
Producers across the plains are dealing with the ongoing drought conditions. You touched on this with your varieties, but what recommendations would you offer to growers at this time?
I think the first question to the grower will be just how much water do you have? Are you going to have water for the whole season or just at the beginning of the season? That will influence some of your decisions of what you're going to do. One option is if you have limited water, just put the water you do have on the best fields and maybe let some fields go dry. The other thing that we're looking at from Mountain View Seeds, I think there's a lot of work being done on how we manage the water we do have, and can we have some alfalfa genetics that will give us some advantages in areas where we have less water. I think it really doesn't pay to stretch the water you have out over the whole season if it's limited, what they call the starvation diet. I think all you do is you create several cuts that aren't very high yielding, and really your harvest costs aren't worth harvesting those low yields. And so I think you really need to be able to put adequate water on whatever cuts you're going to harvest. And what we're looking at Mountain View Seeds is this new type of genetics. What we actually do is take the limited water we have and put that on maybe the first couple of cuts. And those are the highest quality cuts, forage quality cuts, and also they're the highest amount of yield that you have in that season comes in those first 2 cuts. If you have limited water, do that. And then during the middle of the summer where the water use efficiency is not as great, you have high temperatures and you put water on those summer cuts and you're not getting really good quality and a little bit less yield. And what we've done is develop alfalfa varieties that can respond to that type of treatment of just watering the beginning of the season and then just shutting the water off during the middle of summer. And what happens when you shut the water off in the middle of summer, the alfalfa goes into a drought-induced dormancy. The alfalfa without that water just quits growing. It looks like almost like the alfalfa would during the winter, that dormancy period, it just quits growing. But we have alfalfa now that has the genetics to survive those periods of drought and summer drought and go into that dormancy. And then once water is restored, they come back and near normal or normal production after water is restored. And that's what we call that drought-induced dormancy advantage. And View has three varieties and get ready to bring on a fourth variety, all the way from a fall dormancy all the way down to an 8 dormancy, covering a lot of parts of the West. And so I think that is something that people will start looking at in the future is maybe you're harvesting less tonnage in the season, but you're harvesting good quality alfalfa, and you reduce some of your harvest costs by not harvesting those low-yielding summer cuts. It still can make alfalfa profitable, just a different way of managing the water that you have and capitalizing on the improved genetics that can withstand long periods of not having water during the middle of the summer. And again, that's working in most soils. There are some areas where you have maybe high temperatures over 100 degrees most of the summer, and then sandy soils that may not be as workable in those type of soils, but in other parts of the country, it looks like it's going to be feasible to do that drought-induced dormancy and still maintain alfalfa fields over a period of time. So that's what we're looking at. I think farmers just look at and see how much water you have, and we're going to see this new type of genetics and see if it has some real advantages going forward. And with climate change, I think farmers out west, your aquifers are being and less river water. And so again, I think the whole drought climate change aspect out west, farmers are going to have to figure out if they're going to raise alfalfa, they may have to do it a little bit different than what they've done in the past.
Talk a little bit about some management strategies that can help you maintain that forage quality and the yield during drought conditions.
Yeah, I think taking advantage of what you do have, like I said, if you water those first couple cuts, that's when the highest quality alfalfa is being produced, those first cuts. And that is really an advantage as far as the forage quality. It gives you some decent tonnage right there at the beginning of the season. Other things, if you don't have enough water for some of those fields, if it gets above 10 inches, you could probably cut those fields. But due to lack of water, if it doesn't get over 10 inches, and you may not want to harvest that because it's probably not feasible profit-wise of harvesting something that low in tonnage. And also you're putting added stresses to that alfalfa. And so during a drought period, you want to try to reduce the amount of stress on those fields so that when you do get water back, that field is still healthy enough to recover. And so fertility is still important. You don't have to over-fertilize, but you don't want to put a fertility stress on that field. If you have insects, you need to monitor your fields and make sure that you don't have any insects that are feeding on whatever regrowth there is out there. Again, whatever you can do to reduce the amount of stress on that field, water back, that is important.
A follow-up question, what about the following season after it's dry? Is there anything they need to think about following a drought?
I think following the drought, if maybe that first cut, if it was under a little bit of stress in that previous year, maybe extending that first cut a little bit more. We know that when you cut alfalfa, that first regrowth that's coming up is coming out of the food reserves in that root system. And so if it was a little bit stressed going into the winter and maybe the root reserves weren't optimal, maybe that first cut, you want to let it grow a little bit longer past that normal harvest date of 10th bloom is when we normally harvest, when the alfalfa is just starting to bloom. At that point, usually the top growth has been sufficient enough to recharge the root system. So if that alfalfa was under a little stress, maybe extending it to close to full bloom on that first cut, and that gives you a healthy root system with adequate food reserves to carry out the rest of the season.
Is there anything else forage producers should be thinking about in looking into this growing season?
I think if you're starting this spring, you're going to plant a new field and make sure you get a good variety, one that's adapted to your location, one that has all the desirable characteristics that you need to market your variety. You need to look at, what is your market for your alfalfa hay? Are you looking at the dairy market? Then if you are, then you need to be scheduling your management to provide dairy quality hay. If you're trying to sell your hay and nobody's willing to pay you for the extra forage quality, maybe you should start looking at just trying to increase the tonnage of that season. If they're just paying on a number of tons, you can adjust your management to produce the most tons and maybe not concentrate as much on the forage quality. And so it just depends on your market, how you're trying to market your alfalfa, and that will determine some of your management decisions going forward.
Right. Thanks, Don, for joining us on HPJ Talk.
Glad to have me. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Mountain View Seeds. Mountain View Seeds partners with breeders and growers across the country to develop and supply high-performing forage genetics. Our alfalfa program focuses on strong yield potential, forage quality, disease resistance, and stand persistence. Varieties like MVS 4220Q, Majestic 425, and the New Mix alfalfa line are built to perform in real-world conditions and help producers get more from every acre. Learn more about the Mountain View Seeds alfalfa program at mountainviewseeds.com. That's mtviewseeds.com.